All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Macroeconomics. So I have here a list of topics that hopefully we're going to cover today. And you can see that the second one here says price level. And you'll remember from last week, if you were here, that we discussed that, first we talked about how the class is structured, then we talked about what is macroeconomics. It's the study of economic aggregates. Then we talked about a particular aggregate, which was GDP, which is a measure of total production. And then in order to measure GDP, we need to use market prices, which creates a problem, because that means that when you see a change in GDP, it could be because there was more production or because something happened to the prices. We defined real GDP, which keeps the prices constant based on a base year. And we discussed that means that any divergence between nominal and real GDP, nominal being the one that is measured using market prices, tells us about what's happening to prices. So today we'll talk about that. But before we get there, there's one more thing that I think is worth discussing about GDP. And that is that if you add up all the production in an economy over a particular period of time, the number that you get is actually going to equal the total income generated in that place over a particular period of time. And that's important for several reasons. One, just from the measurement perspective, it means that you have more than one way of trying to measure GDP. If you're the Bureau of Economic Analysis, it means that you can measure it both ways and check to see if your numbers match up, and if they don't, well, you need to go figure out what's off. But more fundamentally, we justified looking at GDP because it's a measure of total production, which means it's telling us about overall economic activity in this place over this period of time. But income is less abstract, right? That's much closer to home. You know what income is. You know what it is to have it. You know what it is not to have it. So when we see GDP changing over time, going up or going down, it's not just telling us that things are being made. It's also telling us about the income of the people involved. Something which is much closer to home, something that you can see is going to be something you might worry about if you're someone in charge of economic policy. You want to make sure that people's livelihoods are taken care of. And GDP equals income, so it's telling us something about that. So the first thing I want to do is persuade you that this identity is the case. And broadly, the intuition is as follows. Suppose you lived alone on an island. If you lived alone on an island, anything you produce clearly is the same thing as your income. Right? There's no other source of income. It's what you do, what you generate. But now imagine you're stranded on this island with a friend. And now your friend can help you in whatever production activity you have. So now, together you produce something, and then maybe you have to pay part of it to your partner, so that's their income. The rest you keep, that's your income. But it should be pretty clear that if you add both of them together, what's the total amount? It's the same as what you produced. Right? So that's the intuition for this GDP equals income thing. Okay? So to look at a broader example of this, we're going to need, to make things more interesting and to show that it's a more general result, we're going to need a few things. First, let's imagine that, there are lots of people. Then we'll imagine that in that example, there was one person and one source of income. Let's imagine that there's multiple sources of income. Multiple things you could be doing. So let's suppose that one thing you could be generating in this economy, let's say it's an advanced economy near to the present age, let's say that one of the key goods that is produced in this economy is computers. Okay? And let's say that there's another activity, and let's say that that other activity, aside from building computers, is digging up silicon out of the ground. Now, why did I pick that? Remember, GDP is total production of final goods and services, right? This is a final good. So whatever computers are produced, that's going to go into GDP. This isn't the final good, right? This is actually an intermediate good, because you use this to make that. So we're going to look at an example that's going to be interesting in the sense that we're going to show that GDP equals income even when we have intermediate goods floating around. Somehow they're not going to end up being part of final goods and services, and somehow they're not going to end up being part of income either. Or rather, the presence isn't going to affect the number that we end up with. All right? Now what do we need, what do we need to make computers and silicon? Going to make life simple, but not too simple. What is the most important resource that you need for producing things? Us, labor, exactly, our effort. So there's going to be some labor involved in producing computers and silicon. Now there are other productive inputs in the world, including things that you dig out of the ground. That's actually here. There's another input I'm not going to put in here, just to keep things relatively simple, but in principle, when you produce things, like you don't literally dig silicon out of the ground. In reality, you would need mining equipment, right? Machinery. If you're producing computers, you probably need machinery for assembly. You also would need a factory building. So all that together, buildings and machinery, we refer to as capital. I'm not going to put it here. Just keep it in mind because it's going to come up later, actually on Wednesday. To keep things simple, the only things you need to produce other things here are labor and, well, you need silicon as well, right? Because that's one of the inputs for making computers. So we'll ignore capital and other, other inputs. Just need labor and silicon. Why don't we put some curly brackets here? And here we're going to write down how much production there was of each of these things. So we're going to put up some random numbers here, and they will be random because I'm not going to put them in. You're going to tell me what numbers to put in. Then we'll figure out what's GDP, we'll figure out what's total income, and we'll see why they're always going to be equal. Okay? So please give me a large two-digit number for the total production of computers. Anyone? 81. Okay. 3 to the power 4. All right, sounds good. And how about a smaller number for how much silicon is produced? 6? All right, sure. Now we need to figure out what the inputs are, or the cost of the inputs. Okay? We know this is 6, right? Because we know that, well, where did all this silicon go? It was sold to the computer company, which used it to make computers, right? And I guess we can put 0 here, because you don't need silicon to make silicon. Although we could put something else as long as these two add up to 6, that's fine. Right. Now, how much labor is used in the computer industry? A number? Sorry? 6? Did you say? How about something different from this, just so you can easily track the numbers? 9 is good. And how about another number smaller than 6 for how much labor is used in silicon? I heard 2 first, so let's go with 2. All right, and now we're going to compute GDP. And we're going to compute total income. So what's total GDP here? Well, it's a total value of goods and services. Final goods and services. So we have 81. That's the value of computers. And we have nothing, right? This is not a final good nor service. So GDP is 81. That's it. What about total income? Okay. There are 2 sources of income in this economy. One is that there are people who work, the labor. There are people who work in the computer industry. There are people who work digging up silicon. And what's that value? Well, it's 9 from the computer industry and 2 from the silicon industry, which is 11. The other source of income here is that you might be the person, or one of the people, who owns the computer factories or the silicon mines. Now, if you own a computer factory or a silicon mine, what you earn as income are the profits. And what are the profits? You should remember from micro, but here's a reminder. The profits of the computer industry are not the total sales. Right? It's going to be the total sales, but minus any costs they incurred in order to make the thing, in this case computers. Or using language that you're more likely to have seen in your micro class, this is going to be your revenue, again, minus the costs, or sales minus costs. The incoming funds minus the outgoing payments. So, there are 2 kinds of ways of generating profits here. One is you might be one of the owners of the computer industry, and then what do you get? Well, the revenue is 81, but you had to pay workers 9, and you had to buy 6 of silicon. 81 minus 9, 72, minus 6, 66. And what about the silicon industry? Sales of 6, but they incur costs of 2. That leaves you 4. So what's total income in this economy? 66 plus 4 is 70. 70 plus 11, 81. So 81 here, 81 here. They're equal. And again, you know it's not because I made up these numbers. I didn't. You made up these numbers. Randomly, different people. So it's not like I rigged things to get the equality. This is going to be generally true. Yes? Sorry? Because the profits from the silicon industry, the revenue is 6, the labor cost is 2, so the profits are 6 minus 2 is 4. Okay? And same for computers. The revenue is 81, the costs are 9 and 6. So then the question, any other comments, thoughts? So then the question is, why is this happening? And the eagle-eyed among you will see that a lot of these numbers are showing up twice. Once with a minus and once with a plus. So let's look here. Here is the 81, right? This is actually the total sales of computers. And the profits of the computer industry owners aren't 81 because you have to subtract the cost of labor and subtract the cost of the inputs, intermediates. But notice that this labor cost, which is subtracted here, ends up being the income, bless you, of the laborers. So there's a minus 9 here, but a plus 9 here. They cancel out. And this minus 6, which is the cost of intermediate inputs, is minused here, but it's plussed here because it's the revenue of whoever owns the silicon mines. And this -2, which is the labor cost in the silicon industry, is going to be canceling out with this +2, which is, well, the income of those laborers. So when all is said and done, my cost is your income, so they cancel out. When we add everything up, at the end of the day, all we're left with is the value of the final goods and services. Okay? And that's going to be the same no matter how many industries we have, no matter how many layers of production we have. Let's say maybe you dig up the silicon, but then you have to combine it with something else, and then you have to use it to make semiconductors, and then those have to be shipped off somewhere else, and then those things are assembled into computers along with screens and all sorts of other things. Doesn't matter. You still end up with GDP equals income, and hopefully this makes it more visually intuitive, because any cost to me is income to you or to someone else. So when we add up all the income, all we end up is recovering the same value as the final goods and services. Any questions, comments, doubts about this? All right. So, let's see, I'm going to take a picture of this, just in case. And although I guess maybe there's no point since we actually have this all on video. There we go. No. Sorry. I'm trying to make sure the video is pointing at the board. I just decided to be annoying. All right. That's good. Sorry about that. So that takes care of the first point. GDP equals income. Next, as I said, we want to look at a different kind of aggregate. This makes a funny noise. I should put it on TikTok. So next, there's another kind of aggregate, as I was mentioning, which has to do with prices. And first, I'm going to remind you of how it entered our discussion. It entered our discussion sort of as a byproduct of our discussion of GDP, interestingly. And that was the following. Remember from last week, and if you weren't there, check out the recording. Oh dear. So remember from last week, that's better, we discussed GDP, and I showed you a handmade picture of how GDP behaves over time. We defined it first as the total value of final goods and services measured in a particular place over a particular period of time, and I said that if you measure that, you'll see it going up over time. And then we discussed that, well, in a way, this isn't really telling us anything. Why? Because we're using market prices to measure it. So if it goes up, it could be for two completely different reasons. One, it might be that there's more and more stuff being made. Two, it might just be that prices are rising. And those are two completely different things that as economists, we probably want to distinguish between. So instead, we define this as nominal GDP, the one that doesn't distinguish between prices and quantities. And then we defined real GDP. And real GDP was saying, well, let's just pick a year, let's call it the base year, and then we will just hold the prices fixed from that base year. So then if we see that thing changing over time, it can be because of inflation or deflation or prices changing because the prices aren't changing. And so we said, well, just to make this picture clearer, let's say the base year is 1947. So we start here. It turns out that that thing, which is real GDP, also turns out to go up. But it doesn't go up as fast because, as we all know, there is inflation. Prices tend to rise over time, so that means that this one grows a bit faster because this one contains the inflation and this one doesn't. Right? So that's basically last class in 90 seconds. And one thing I said last class was that that means that this gap, right, which is telling us something about how much faster this thing is growing than this one, this gap reflects what's happening to prices. If this gap gets bigger, it means prices are rising. This gap gets smaller, it means prices are declining. Because this one is mixing prices and quantities and this one isn't. So, this tells us that we can try and use this gap to get a sense of what's happening to prices, and we will do so in the following fashion. We'll define a measure of how high, how low prices are as follows. We'll take nominal GDP and divide it by real GDP. And we're going to multiply it by 100. Why multiply it by 100? I know economists often do this, but when numbers are sort of the order of magnitude of 100, it means it's very easy to compute its growth rate. That's why. Right? So in the base year, which in this example is 1947, what's this? What's the value of this? 100, right? Because in the base year, these two are the same, right? And the next year, suppose it comes in, you measure this thing, and you end up with a slightly larger number here than here. Let's say this went up by 3%. So you can say, okay, this whole thing, it turns out to be 103. It's slightly bigger than it started. Then you can easily think, oh, okay, so it's gone from 100 to 103. Inflation is 3%. You see what I mean? That's why we multiply by 100. So if you measured what's happening to prices this way, we'll recap that in a second. What you would end up with is something called the GDP deflator. That's what this is called. The deflator is just something you use to measure prices. It's like to extract the influence of inflation, you need a deflator. That's why it's called that. And again, you would track what this is doing over time to get a sense of inflation. So just for sake of completeness, we're going to define the inflation rate as the growth rate of prices. So it's, remember the growth rate formula from last week? But we use that to think about growth of GDP, not growth of prices. It's the same formula for this. It's going to be price level this year minus price level last year. So this is the change. You scale it by where you started, price level last year. And then to make it a percent, we multiply it by 100. Okay? So this is a measure of how high prices are, which it's kind of an arbitrary, has an arbitrary starting point of 100 in the base year. But given that you have a starting point, you can then use it to measure the growth rate of prices. So this doesn't mean anything by itself, but this does, because inflation is, as we are learning these days, something with a real impact. Well, okay. I just mentioned that because you may know inflation is rather high these days compared to what it has been historically in the United States. We haven't had inflation rates like this since like the 70s or something. All right. Any questions, comments, thoughts about this? Okay, so this is a measure of the price level, but it's not the only one. And there's a good reason for that. This is telling us about what's happening to the prices of, well, whatever goes into GDP, right? So that's all final goods and services produced. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a good indicator of how price changes affect you and me. What do I mean by that? There are lots of things in GDP that you and I don't use, right? Some things are produced that you and I don't buy. Let's say, I don't know, surface-to-air missiles, oil rigs, bridges. All of those things are produced, but you and I don't buy them. Why does that matter? It matters because of some of the things for which you might want to use inflation rates. So for example, as you probably know, the government provides income to all sorts of different people, low-income households in the form of food stamps and so on, social security payments to retirees. And as prices change, the government often changes the amount that people get, changes the amount of all those benefits to adjust for the cost of living to keep their purchasing power in terms of goods and services about the same. And if they did that using the GDP deflator, they might be doing it in some sense incorrectly, right? Because this contains a bunch of goods that you and I, or whoever the beneficiaries are, retirees, low-income households, don't need. So if you hear about inflation rates in the news, chances are inflation rates are using a measure of the price level that's not the GDP deflator. So let's label this 1. Chances are, if you hear about anything to do with the price level in the news, what you're hearing about is something else called the Consumer Price Index. Or that's not a C, CPI. So the CPI is a different measure of the price level, which you could then use to compute inflation, which is specifically targeted on understanding how prices affect you and me. So a typical household. Now, how is it measured? The way it's measured is that instead of figuring out the value of all final goods and services, what you do is you hire an army of statisticians to go out to supermarkets and other stores around the land to survey people on their spending habits. Like, what are people buying? How much of it? And that includes goods and services, right? It includes apples and oranges, it includes food, it includes gas, it includes cars, because, you know, some households are buying a car every now and then. Refrigerators, rent, that's a big part of it, right? Housing costs, that's a big part of everyone's expenses. And they survey everyone, figure out what's a typical household consuming, and they call that a basket of goods, okay? So first they figure out the cost of a typical basket of goods consumed. And then what do? They divide it by the cost of the basket in, as always with these price indices, the base year. So you have to pick a base year, sort of starting point, or I guess a standard of some kind, benchmark. And then you're measuring the cost of this basket of goods relative to where it started, and again, times 100. So again, if it goes from 100 to 102, it's easy to just see, 2% inflation. It goes from 200 to 202, okay, 1% inflation. So it's easier to do this sort of quick mental calculation with numbers of that size. All right? Any questions, thoughts, comments? Okay. Yes?
How often does the basket of goods change? Or does it just change over time?
Excellent question. So, to measure this meaningfully, you would think it has to be the same basket, right? Because otherwise you're not comparing the same thing, right? And that creates problems, which I think is why you're asking this. You kind of feel this isn't so straightforward, right? So, let's see. So, there are several potential problems with implementing this that mean that the way I described it literally may have issues. And so, either you need to be aware of those issues, which is what we're going to do now, or if you're a statistician actually doing this, you need to find some way around it. So there are at least 3 problems I can think of that you'd run into if you tried to implement this. One is, you said how often. So you're thinking about the fact that the typical basket of, right, implicitly what you're worried about is the typical basket of goods could change over time, right? So, just for sake of argument, what if we measured our basket of goods in 1947, like we did for GDP? And actually, some of these problems GDP suffers as well. What do we do about this? These things weren't around in 1947. Or what do we do about this? These things weren't around in 1947. So, one issue to worry about is the possibility that new goods are invented. And then our spending patterns change because there are just some things that appear that we want, but that didn't even exist. That suggests you should use a recent basket, which is, I guess, where you started. You probably want to revise this thing periodically. And that's complicated because then that means that if I keep changing the basket, then my old data are no longer compatible with my new data. So that's a big problem, indeed. Yes?
Couldn't you just take the price of the computer now and deflate it with trends of how things will move and then put it in?
I think you have in mind a slightly different issue, right? So there's the issue that a computer today, okay, there were no computers in 1947. I think ENIAC was 1948, but if you were trying to deal with this versus, let's say, the 1990s, the problem is not that there are no computers, it's that they changed in their attributes, right? Those computers are no longer, right. Whereas this is actually about the fact that they didn't even exist. Yeah, so, but we'll get there. That's exactly the next point. So another way to deal with this, and I mean, this, if you think about it, the same is true for GDP, right? That also has this issue. How do you deal with, if your base year was 1947, how do you deal with the price of computers? there were none. So there's a solution which I'm not going to inflict on you, because I think, maybe this is my bias, but I think it's not really economics, it's more statistics, it's a measurement issue. Like, I want you to intuitively understand what we're trying to do, and then be aware of the issues. And then one solution is a statistical solution called chain-weighted indices, which basically uses a combination of the basket of goods from then, the basket of goods today, the prices from then, and the prices today. So there's ways of using all of them to try and get around this. There is a box at the end of chapter 4, I think, or is it 5? I think it's 4. Anyway, there's a box that talks about this, if you're interested. As I said, I'm not going to go over the details with you now. When I took macro, the entire first class was about this. Only these different ways of trying to create chain-weighted indices, and it just drove all of us to sleep. So, and it's not economics. Right? Economics is trying to understand how it is that economic aggregates behave. So that's one issue, new goods. There's a second issue which you raised, which is that goods change over time, even if they exist. Right? And the computers is a great example. So the first computer I bought in the 90s, and it was a laptop. It had a black and white screen. It could not connect to the internet. And if it had, the internet would have been a very different environment. And it was much slower in terms of processing speed and much worse in terms of memory than this tiny phone probably is, right? So the issue there isn't that new goods appeared, it's that goods improve. Technical progress doesn't just result in the invention of new goods, it also results in the improvement of pre-existing goods. And computers is, I guess, and electronics is the most egregious example, but actually this is true of many other things. Let's say, back in the 90s when I bought my first computer, what qualified as office furniture? A large, heavy leather chair, right? What's office furniture now? You guys know what a gaming chair is, right? Those things are really comfortable, super adjustable, right? Those things didn't exist. So technical progress is everywhere. So everything is improving. And some things more than others. And so the question is, how does that affect how you want to measure GDP? Because the computer that I bought in the 90s cost about $2,000. If you buy a good computer by today's standards, what's it going to cost you? About $2,000. Maybe even less, actually. But these are completely different things in terms of their quality. So there is a way to deal with that, which is actually the way the Bureau of Economic Analysis measures things these days, which is called hedonic pricing. And what's that? That means that instead of counting how many computers a household buys, and instead of pricing how many computers a household buys, you compute how many gigabytes of memory a household buys in the computer and figure out what the price of that is. So instead of measuring the basket in terms of units of an item, you measure it in terms of its qualities. Memory, processing speed, and so on. And of course, you can't do that directly, so you need your army of statisticians to get data and figure out what is the price of a megabyte? What is the price of a megahertz? What is the price of color versus black and white screen? What is the price of office chair with adjustable arms versus non-adjustable arms? And measure all of that. Sounds like a pain, but again, they're statisticians. They chose that career. They must enjoy it. And it results in useful data, hopefully. So that's improved goods. I guess, let me not write improved goods. I'm going to write quality bias, because that's the real name of this issue. Bias in this context means, in a statistical context, bias means that you're doing some measurement that means that you're systematically over-measuring something or under-measuring something, or overestimating something or underestimating something. Okay? All right. And on the one hand, you can say, well, okay, fine, this is something that if you really want the right numbers, you need to be careful about as a statistician or as an economist. But, interestingly, some of these issues, in particular quality bias, end up being things that have real-world policy or political implications. So, I haven't heard this issue lately because I guess the Bureau of Economic Analysis now applies hedonic pricing when it's doing all this stuff. But there was a time in, I guess, also the 90s, when the use or non-use of hedonic pricing actually became a big political issue in the United States. Why would politicians care about this? Well, remember how I motivated the use of the CPI. I said it's a price index that the government might need if it wants to try and adjust benefits, food stamps, social security, and so on. Well, those benefits themselves are not something, I mean, there are politicians, and I guess since the politicians are there because people voted for them, I guess politicians are human. I have to admit that. So, not everyone agrees on whether or not there should be any of these benefits in the first place. And certainly even among those who agree, you might not agree on the amount, right? So that means that when it's time to adjust benefits using the CPI, it may become a political issue exactly how you should measure the CPI, because one group maybe doesn't want the benefits to go up, right? And then so they'll argue, you know, you're overestimating inflation because you forgot about the fact that computing has become more powerful, which means that actually prices of megahertz have gone down because the computers are priced the same, but they're much better. So that actually was a literal argument in the in Congress in the United States in the sometime in the 90s. All right, so that's two of them. Any questions, thoughts about any of these? There's one last problem with the CPI that in a sense is more fundamental, because even if there were no new goods and even if there were no quality bias, this problem would still be there. And that is, I'm going to tell you what it's called, and then I'll tell you what it is. It's called substitution bias. And what's the problem here? The issue here has to do with the fact that when there is inflation, as I'm sure you know from personal experience over the past few months, it is not true that all prices rise together. Some prices go up, some prices go down, some go up faster than others. So I mentioned the last few months because you may recall a few months ago the price of gasoline, even the cheapest, was almost $6 a gallon. Remember that? Now it's gone back down again. But it was not the truth that the price of everything kind of doubled around that time, right? And it's not, and now gas has gone down to 4-ish. It doesn't mean that the price of everything dropped along with it, right? So that example is useful for seeing how, again, prices don't always change together. Some move up while others don't. Now, in the case of gas, if the price of gas goes up, there's not much you can do, right? I guess you could drive less, but there's not much you can do to avoid it other than, or maybe that is a good example, actually. The price of gas goes up. Can you avoid it? Maybe you could, actually. For example, you guys have to come to class, but let's think about professors. I have to be here, I mean, I love to come to work every day. He'll have to see you. But, there's some faculty who stay home unless they have to come to work. What could they do instead if the price of gas goes up and they say, I really need to save some money here? They could have Zoom meetings, Zoom office hours instead of coming in. So even for gas, there are ways of avoiding it because there are substitutes. A better example is probably food, because it's clear that if out of all the kinds of food that you might want to eat, if one of them becomes more expensive, there are plenty of other options, right? So why is that a problem? The problem is because you could argue, and some economists do, the whole point here is that for this to be measuring things consistently, as you were indicating, the basket of goods has to be fixed, right? But we know, as discussed, that the prices of all things don't move together. So typically some things become really expensive and some things don't. And what are you doing to the extent that different goods and services are substitutes? The prices that go up the most, or the goods with the prices that go up the most, are the goods that you're going to avoid, right? And so the argument goes, that means that CPI-based inflation is always overstating inflation. Because, yeah, sure, some goods become more expensive, but then you stop buying them. So they're not in your basket of goods anymore, in reality, even though to measure it, you need to keep it fixed. So some economists say that means CPI overstates inflation, but there's a counter-argument, which is the fact that you were obliged to substitute away from it. Isn't that a cost? You wouldn't have changed your consumption pattern if the prices hadn't gone up in this unequal way. And so the CPI measured this way is at least capturing some of that discomfort or awkwardness. And that awkwardness really is not just an inconvenience, it actually has real costs. So here's an example. Let's say I distinctly remember many, many years ago, there used to be this restaurant on 18th Street called Singapore Bistro, where I used to love to go to lunch. They had this giant bowl of seafood laksa, which is a kind of hot, spicy soup. And it was enormous, and so I'd sit down there, pay $10, and eat half of it and take the other half home for dinner. And it was delicious. And then one day I walked in there, I sat down, opened the menu, seafood laksa, $13. 30% inflation. That's a lot, right? From one day to the next, or 1 week to the next. What did I do? What would you do? Has the price of everything risen by 30%? No. These guys decided to jack up their prices. So what am I going to do? Leave, right? Go to the Thai place down the street where they also have seafood soup and where their prices haven't risen by $30. But that's costly. Because one of the things that happen, if prices are increasing at some places but not others, what does it mean you do? It means you have to spend more time shopping around. Those are real resources, right? It's your time that you could have spent studying, or in my case, teaching, or spending time with students in office hours, right? It's still a real resource that's being absorbed when there's inflation. So I'm not so worried about substitution bias, as long as you say, we keep updating our basket of goods, because those are real costs of inflation. Even if we substitute away from stuff, that's still costly. And this measure captures that. So again, I don't want to persuade you one way or the other. I just want to make sure that you're aware of these issues. And then you can form your own decision based on your own judgment. Okay? Any questions, comments, doubts? All right. Last but not least, there is one more measure of the price level that I want you to be aware of. It's called the Producer Price Index, or PPI. And based on the name, you can probably figure out what it is. It's measured the exact same way. The only difference is the basket of goods. Instead of the cost of a typical basket of goods consumed, it's produced, as the name would suggest. And you may wonder, what's the point of that? You already have a measure of how prices of goods produced are changing. But it turns out there are several reasons why this is useful. One, remember, this is the total price of final goods and services when they've been, well, they're final goods and services, so it's when they're finalized, right? When they're sold to the end user. Whereas a producer price index is measured as soon as the good leaves the factory door. Right? And the price that you and I face is probably not going to be the price when the thing leaves the factory door, because there are various distribution stages between the thing leaving the factory and it reaching you. Right? If you buy a can of Red Bull at the GW Deli around the corner, that's not leaving the factory, right? Leaving the factory happened a long time before that, and then it went to a distributor, and then it went on a truck, and then it went here and there, and then it ended up at the GW Deli where you finally bought the thing, right? So the prices are not the same. So the point is, when you measure the prices of things as soon as they leave the factory door, this is the first time the thing is getting priced. That's why this is useful, because it means that if you see the producer price index jump, it's an early warning that, oh, inflation is probably coming. Right? Yes?
So is this measuring the price that producers are paying to make one can of Red Bull, or the price that the producers are selling it to the distributors for?
Selling to the distributors. It's not based on the cost of production. This is based on, good clarifying question. It's based on the first time the good left the factory and is on its way to you and me.
So it includes their profit.
Right. Any profits that they generated, right. It's the revenue from before, exactly. Or the price part of that, yeah. Revenue is price times quantity. So yes, it's that price. Good. Any thoughts, comments about either of these measures of prices or inflation? All right, I think that's this and this taken care of. Finally, let me check the time. We have other aggregates. What other aggregates could there be? Well, we were discussing that, actually I forget if I mentioned this, but remember that we were discussing that labor is this critical input, and that's why we put it right at the beginning when we talked about GDP equals income. I think I didn't mention this, but did I mention this? That labor income is actually about 2/3 of GDP. Did I say that? I didn't. Well, now I did. Labor income is about 2/3 of GDP. That's how important labor is for production. And if labor is 2/3 of GDP, chances are it means that macroeconomists need to understand how labor markets work, right? And indeed, later on, we're going to see that labor has a special place in some of our theories. So, what that means is that in addition to production aggregates, and price aggregates, there are going to be a whole bunch of labor market aggregates that we'll also be interested in keeping track of. We won't spend that much time on them. They'll often be sort of in the background, but they are important. So I'm going to tell you about a couple quickly, and if we have time, Maybe we can have an exit quiz today. I think we end at 12:25, so I think we do have just enough time. There's one labor market aggregate that you probably hear a lot about if you ever follow economic news, and that's the unemployment rate. So I'm going to define that for you quickly. An unemployed person is someone who is out of work and looking for work. That's important. Suppose you give up looking for work. You're not unemployed. Yeah?
How do you determine if someone's looking for work or not?
That's a good question. Surveys, I guess. But that's exactly one of the problems. Defining this is hard. Like suppose that suppose you're part of the gig economy and you take DoorDash deliveries and drive them from, I don't know, McDonald's to end users. Are you unemployed? You're kind of sort of employed, right? And that's exactly one of the problems here. Indeed, that in practice, especially now, because the gig economy didn't exist 20 years ago, it's become harder and harder to really define what we want to measure here. So that's exactly one of the points I wanted to make. Yes?
Why is looking for work a key here? I mean, shouldn't out of work be kind of enough?
So it's defined well, this is how it's defined, right? And looking for work means that you're when they survey you to ask you, are you looking for work? What they mean is, did you send out any resumes? Like they actually ask you specifically about that, and that's how I define whether you look for work or not, right? Or did you knock on any doors? Did you? Whether they should, I guess, indeed, that's a concern, right? If I gave up working, or if I'm a heroin addict and I dropped out of the whole workforce because that's my condition, don't we want to measure that? I mean, you could measure it. I mean, there are other measures for that, but so we'll get back to that in a second. The unemployment rate is this divided by, again, the group of people who might be working. So this is called the labor force, and that's defined as you are unemployed, as defined there, or employed. So it doesn't count the people who aren't looking for work. And again, we could argue, is that really what we want to measure? Maybe if people have given up, shouldn't that be something that we care about? And I guess you could measure those people too separately, but the fact is this gets a lot of discussion in the media, right? And so, for example, and that's maybe questionable, because as discussed, suppose that a bunch of people who are out of work find work. What happens to the bottom number here? Nothing, right? We have some people who are unemployed and now they switch to being employed. The total is the same, but this number goes down. So unemployment rate went down. And why did it go down? It went down because a bunch of people found work. So it sounds like the labor market is healthy and the economy is doing well in that sense, right? Yes, sorry. Is the population.
If the population number increases, so does the labor force.
Yep.
That doesn't necessarily mean the unemployment decreases.
Well, okay, the labor force, I guess, is defined as, so changing the population doesn't necessarily mean either of these changed, right? Because if a bunch of babies are born, they're neither unemployed nor employed, right? Because they're not looking for work. So it takes time for population growth to feed through into either of these things. And then hopefully in a good economy, you have the steady flow of more jobs as more people enter the labor force, which I guess makes sense because, well, the more of us there are, it's both more potential employees and more potential employers. So hopefully that balance is going to keep things in check. The case that I'm most worried about, or that I think is most problematic, is what if a bunch of people give up looking for work? Sorry, that's my alarm. What if a bunch of people give up, stop looking for work? They are no longer unemployed, right? Because they're not looking, so they don't count. They're also not in the labor force. What happens to this number? It goes down by however many people gave up. What happens to this number? It also goes down, but compared to the full labor force, that number is small. So when a bunch of people quit looking for work, what happens to the unemployment rate? It goes down. But that's not a sign of a healthy economy. If a bunch of people gave up looking for work, it's probably the opposite. So, in that sense, focusing on the unemployment rate is misleading for all the variety of reasons that we just discussed. It could be going down because good things are happening in the labor market. It could be going down because a bunch of people gave up. And I think I mentioned this last class, but remember that I was saying that since 2008, the economy is still growing, but there's a sense in which it kind of didn't recover. And that coincided with a lot of people actually leaving the labor force, retiring early, or just quitting and relying on others. So the unemployment rate right now is less than 4%, which historically is low. Normally, the average is like somewhere between 5 and 6. But it may not be low because the economy is doing great. It may be low because actually a lot of people gave up. Or, starting in 2020, I know a lot of people retired early. The COVID shock hit and they thought, well, screw it. My life plans have changed. I just want to go spend my time traveling the world, or I need to quit because I need to provide help to my ailing mom, or, all these reasons. A lot of people left the labor force. So this number isn't very helpful. I mean, there are other numbers that might be useful. For example, what about the size of the labor force compared to the working age population? That might be useful. More useful, more telling, I guess, about what's going on. And then again, as discussed, there's this gray area of how do you define someone who's employed, or half employed, or sort of employed? What if they work 1 day a week? That's also problematic. Right. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Yes?
How about we use non-farm unemployment or consistent?
Yeah, farms are weird because there's a lot of seasonal work, I guess. So, yeah, there's a lot. Very often you drop farms from macro statistics, that's true. And I guess it's because it's seasonal. There's a lot of migrant labor in farms too, though, which complicates matters even further, I guess. Yeah. Yes?
What's the difference between unemployment rate and labor force participation?
So labor force participation is what I just said. It's, first you have to define the share of the population who could be in the labor force, and that's usually defined by age. So it may be 18 to 65, which again is also a bit weird because some people work who are younger and some people work who are older. And so, then you take the labor force and divide it by that. And I think, so but the potential workforce. And people who are in jail also don't count. People who are students don't count either as part of the potential workforce because you're not working. You're busy studying or you're in jail. So, or you're too young or too old. Everyone else is the potential workforce, and then the participation rate is how much the labor force divided by that number. Yeah, all this is, I believe, in chapter 5. Any other thoughts? Let's see. We do have 9 minutes, and I think that is long enough to have a quiz. So let's see if I can get this thing going. Show the screen. You know what to do. Just find your favorite device, log in, and the winner gets a small token prize. Be quiet. Let's see, how many people do we have? I won't have one of these for every class, but I do happen to have one for today. Let's see, how many are we? So last week we had Tony Yazer, now we have Steve Saranovic. Okay, I'll wait a little longer to see if to let more people in, but soon we'll have to get cracking. So if you're going to participate, please log in as quickly as you can. All right, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's stop at 200 then. There we go. Okay, question 1. Which of the following is true? GDP is total income, GDP is greater than income, less than, or could be either way. They have to be equal, that's right. Steve Saranovic is doing well, unsurprisingly. If I sell you $10 of apples and you use them to make $20 of apple juice, what is our GDP together? It is 20, because only the juice is a final good. If I sell you $10 of apples and you use them to make $20 of apple juice, our total income is what? It's the same. Total income equals total GDP. If your roommate sells you for $50 an econ textbook from last year, how does this affect GDP? It doesn't, because it wasn't produced this year. Next, what is the basket of goods in the CPI? A representative set of goods produced, sold, consumed, or imported. Consumed. It is the CPI, right? Is this the correct formula for the CPI? It is. All right. The CPI goes from 100 to 103. What's the inflation rate? %. Noah's climbing up. What does PPI stand for? Three, two, one. Producer price index. Almost done. The GDP deflator is measured by what? You do need to know this. That's why I'm creating these quizzes for you. There we go. If the real GDP goes from 200 to 202, what's the inflation rate? Didn't expect that. Last of all, if it goes from 300 to 294, what's the inflation rate? If you have to leave, that's fine. We're almost done. We're 5 seconds away from finding out who's the winner. All right. Matthew Wolf is third. Eva is second. And the winner is Noah. Good job, Noah. If you're here still, Noah, please come up. I have a little something for you. Otherwise, nice to see you all. I hope class was useful, and look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Bye-bye.